everybody. Welcome back to the Founders Forum Climate Tech Summit and to London Tech Week. My name is Ellie Cunningham and I'm Head of Community at Founders Forum. We've had a number of fantastic discussions so far today, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel, Carbon Removal and Why Mitigation is Not Enough. A very warm welcome and thank you for joining us to all of our panelists. So joining us today, we've got Jules Kortenhorst, CEO of the Rocky Mountain Institute, Laurie Gaitra, VP of Business Development at Carbon Engineering, Bill Liao, entrepreneur, investor, and co-founder of WeForest, Guy Hudson, co-founder and CEO of the Carbon Soil Co. And once again, welcome back to Lucas Joppa, Chief Environmental Officer at Microsoft, and our moderator, Dr. Julio Friedman, Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. With that, Julio, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. And again, thank you to the Founders Forum for your leadership and for pulling together this extraordinary group of actors and individuals. I'm so delighted to moderate this panel with such an outstanding group. The topic today is CO2 removal, and it's a bit of an uncomfortable topic. CO2 removal acknowledges failure at its heart. First and foremost, it says we have not done what we needed to do to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change. And in fact, we must undo emissions, we must unemit, we will overshoot, and we must claw back. It also is an important topic because we have acknowledged, I think, globally, the need to get to a net zero economy. And net zero requires that if you emit anything anywhere, you must remove it, period. Otherwise, you're not net zero. And stabilizing at any temperature, at 2 degrees or 3 degrees, 5 degrees, that's a net zero framework by definition. And if we're emitting anything in the future, we must have a very large volume of CO2 removal. The last reason why we're bringing this up is kind of a new topic, which is the thought of climate restoration. There's a moral obligation that I think was first and best articulated really in Laudato Si by His Holiness the See, Pope Francis, that is an obligation not only to God's creation, as he framed it, but also to the poorest and most at need among us. Climate restoration acknowledges the moral obligation we have to clean up our mess. And in that context, we're just going to need a big boat. We're going to need a lot of approaches, taking a lot of sectors to task and trying a great number of things, some of which we know a bit about, some of which we're learning about as we go. And this panel really represents, I think, the best of the best in this field. In that context, I'd actually like to start with Jules Kortenhorst. Jules is at the Rocky Mountain Institute as their new executive director, has an extraordinary opportunity to weigh into this space. Jules, if you will.
Thank you, Julio. Yes, I think you framed it very appropriately. We are dealing with a planetary emergency, and we're coming to grips with the fact that despite all of our efforts over the last 10, 20, 30 years, we are not reducing emissions fast enough. And therefore, the reason we're here together today is to deal with that challenge and to deal with the realization that energy efficiency and renewables and new industrial processes, the sort of area of work that RMI has focused on for much of its 40-year history, are in and of itself not sufficient, but that we will also need to sequester carbon. We need to take carbon out of the atmosphere and tuck it away. And for us at RMI, that has been a painful realization because we are in the end techno-optimists. We believe in the solutions that technology can bring to the table. But at the moment, we all have to recognize there is no longer a question of which technology. It is not a silver bullet, it's silver buckshot, it's all the technologies, and carbon sequestration is therefore critically important. It's also why in my spare time, I serve on the board of 2 organizations that in what they do actually help with that. I'm on the board of a company called LandLife, which is using technology to drive down the cost of reforestation, because although trees are by far and away the most cost-effective mechanism we have right now to sequester carbon, we can still make that process more efficient and cost effective. And I'm also privileged to be on the board of Solidia Technologies, a technology developed on the East Coast of the United States to sequester carbon in concrete and thereby reverse some of the emissions that are inherent to creating Portland cement. So the combination of nature-based solutions and technology-driven solutions are going to both be necessary to help us reduce the impact of emissions. And I'm excited to be part of this conversation, therefore. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jules. And in fact, a quick shout out to the good people in Piscataway, New Jersey, working at Solidia. I want to ask you to just spend an extra minute talking a bit about Landlife. Landlife is one of the more interesting companies out there. And specifically in thinking about how they approach forests, they think about it very much in the context of marginal lands. And I was hoping that you would take a minute and then talk about that.
Yes. Many people who worry about sequestering carbon from nature-based solutions worry that we may not have sufficient land. But actually, if you run the numbers, there is an inordinate amount of land capacity around the world that is in that category of degraded land. It is land that once had an important role in the carbon housekeeping system and now is degraded, is no longer able to store the carbon that it used to do in the past. So how do we make more of that degraded land a part of nature-based solutions, a part of sequestering carbon? You do that by thinking through which trees in which way can be planted there where otherwise, for example, agriculture cannot flourish, and doing that in the most cost-effective manner. Landlife's journey started with a cocoon that was able to provide water alongside the seedling, alongside the plant over the course of time. But it has now built beyond that in a whole big data-driven approach that understands precisely which plants to plant where and how you not just restore a monoculture, but a diverse ecosystem that brings back, that sequesters carbon, but that also brings back ecosystems that we have lost in these degraded lands.
Marvelous, thank you. There's a lot to unpack there and we'll have the time to unpack it. But first I'd like to move to the rest of our panel and start actually with a real end member approach in technology, which is direct air capture represented by the extraordinary Laurie Gatry at Carbon Engineering. Laurie, why don't you tell us a bit about how you think about the problem and what Carbon Engineering is doing?
Sure, thanks Julio, and thanks so much for the invitation to join the panel. To talk about carbon dioxide removal, an incredibly important topic. Carbon Engineering is a company that has developed direct air capture technology. And direct air capture is just as it sounds. It's a technological solution to literally vacuum CO2 molecules out of the air because we have too many and we're just adding more, and we need to do very large scale carbon dioxide removal, as Julio mentioned. It's important to know that direct air capture, taking carbon out of the air, isn't new. We've known how to do it for decades, and that's how we put people in submarines and in spacecraft. We know how to scrub the CO2 out of the air. What we didn't know how to do was how to do it at very large scale and do it really cheaply. And so that's the quest that Carbon Engineering set out on back in 2009. Could we get to very large scale and very, very economic to pull the carbon dioxide out? Because we could see for climate solutions that we would need to be able to do that. So fast forward 11 years later, we have developed that technology and we are in the process of taking that technology to scale. And you can see a picture of we've spent 25,000 person hours on the 1 megaton per year plant design, and you see a rendering behind me. We've actually been operating our pilot plant up in British Columbia since 2015 to do direct air capture. And what we've also implemented as a technology solution is the ability to take those CO2 molecules that we pull out of the air and convert them to low carbon fuels. So Carbon Engineering brings really those two pieces of the puzzle to the all of the above solution that we need. How do we do really inexpensive direct air capture at very large climate relevant scale? And also, how do we put those CO2 molecules to work to create low carbon fuels in cases where it's hard to decarbonize, for instance, aviation and long haul transportation. And we think we need a fuel solution as well, but we want a really low carbon fuel. So it's an exciting time. Direct air capture is newer on the scene, but we believe is going to be a really important tool and an available tool in the toolbox as we fight climate change.
Absolutely. Very much the case. In that context, I wanted to see if you could just briefly comment on two things. One of them is there are real costs associated with this, but there's the potential to avoid much larger costs. And this is something which you've done quite a good job thinking about. The other is back to sort of Jules' point about the volumes that are necessary in the comprehensive approach. The National Academies has estimated that 5 billion tons a year at a minimum is what's going to be required from direct air capture. And how does that comport to your business?
Absolutely, thanks. So in terms of getting to that scale and the cost, when we used to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere in spacecraft and submarines, it was previously sort of on the order of $600 a ton to $1,000 a ton. So we knew how to do it. We could spend some money on it, but at climate relevant scale, at the 5 to 10 gigaton scale, it's just not affordable to do it that way. So what we've been designing, we've engineered a solution and tackled the problem with a different kind of technology from the way that CO2 was previously scrubbed, with a target. Our standard commercial plant since we got started was 1 million tons per year. So that's really a building block. That 1 million ton plant can be replicated on sites that need more or can sequester more in geologic formations, for instance. And it's a blueprint that can be, we use off-the-shelf equipment, so it's a blueprint that can be replicated across the world. So you know, Goldman Sachs said that direct air capture and sequestration is essentially almost infinitely scalable. So there really isn't any practical cap to the renewable energy we can use or the underground reservoirs that exist out there that we can put this CO2 back into. We're excited about the potential to put the CO2 into carbon products as well, like concrete. There will be lots of the ways that we put those CO2 molecules to work, but most of them will probably get sequestered underground, safely underground. For us, the really important thing is to get that 1 megaton building block design done so that it can be replicated, and then there's really no limit as to how quickly we can. Well, it takes time. I'm an engineer. I worked on large complex systems for my whole career, and the plant behind me takes about 3 years to build. So it goes painfully slow to be able to realize the actual working plant. But the reality is that that plant can be duplicated across the world. There's lots of great places where we can find the renewable energy and the geologic sequestration to start to pull some of those CO2 molecules out.
I'm glad you brought up geosequestration. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But there's a Mark Twain quote, or it's attributed to Mark Twain. Everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. You're not the only person on the panel who's doing that. I want to pivot now to Bill Liao at SOSV, who's taking a pretty distinct approach in terms of how to think about carbon removal as an enterprise.
Sure. So about 14, 15 years ago, I started to look at this as a problem. Being a technologist, being a techpreneur, I was asked to do some climate work for a small island state as you know, a diplomatic representative, and I thought I'd better take it seriously since they gave me a diplomatic passport and sent me off to the UN. And we homeschooled our kids, and my daughter Willow was, she was just sort of 8, 9 at the time, and she was sitting on my knee and homeschooling. You know, she was studying the same stuff I was, and she looked up at me at one point and said, "Daddy, you broke the planet. You better fix it." And it was quite insightful. And I think my greatest shame is that we keep trying to activate young people to solve this problem when it's our generation that has done more damage to the environment than every other generation of humans combined. You know, so we really need to fix that. And I think one of the biggest problems that I saw back then, which is lesser now, but it was probably the biggest, is that there was this huge divide between the environmental world and the corporate world, where the corporate world was seen universally as the problem. And if we're going to make it, you know, part of the admission that we've already gone over the target is also the admission that we actually need our engines of commerce to function in order to pay for the cleanup. Like, if we ended all commerce today, we stopped all carbon output today, it's still too late. And so I thought, well, how could we engage, you know, and back then, you know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, sequestration technology wasn't even a thing. And looking at all the different costs and all the different ways of doing it, we decided that trees were the thing back then. And so how do you bring multiple fields of force to bear on this problem? Problem one, how do you engage with corporates so that they become a solution? Problem two, how do you acquire enough access to land? Problem three, how do you staff it cheaply? Problem four, how do you make sure that you're not just taking carbon out of the atmosphere, but you're actually generating a sustainable kind of income? And we combined a bunch of technologies. So we create permaculture food forests. They're mosaic food forests. We create them on degraded land. We create them in partnership with local people. We educate them. We create jobs for them. They own their forests, and they create commercial opportunities out of those forests in food and other high-value molecule production. And it's all funded by corporate sponsorship. Because what I saw was that the spirit of a tree planted in Uganda can actually impact the heart of a consumer in Germany or in Detroit. You know, there's no reason why the tree has to be planted next to you. And in fact, it does a lot more good planted next to a village woman in Uganda or in Ethiopia or in the Kilisi Hills in India than it does at the end of the driveway of your gated community. Still a good thing to have a tree at the end of the driveway of your gated community, but that's not the source of livelihood. Now, there's a saying in quite a few of our African plantings, you know, no trees, no honey, no honey, no money. We look for the forest to provide an incredible range of economic opportunities for local people. And so our actual cost per ton is a couple of bucks and has been for years now. When we started, you know, 12 years ago, it was about 10 bucks a ton. It's now a fifth of that. And we could see ways to make it even smaller with trees. And as Jules said before, there's plenty of land. There's at least 23 million square kilometers of degraded land right next to a whole bunch of people that need to move up the economic ladder. And that's what WeForest does.
Thank you. There's so many directions to go from this. I look forward to getting to questions in the future about the youth movement, about indigenous communities, about all these sorts of things. One thing that I will ask you about, though, is the limits of voluntary markets. I certainly agree that corporates are a great way to start, and we have one of the best in the world with us today. But we also understand that there's limits to how much of that will actually accomplish. What do you see as sort of the successor to a voluntary corporate-based pathway?
Actually, if you look at the global corporate economy, you look at the total amount of money that's spent on marketing, what we need to spend to actually reverse climate change with just with trees, you know, not counting everything else, is kind of a rounding error over time. You know, I actually believe it's a sustainable thing. And the beauty of the approach of engaging people at the grassroots is that the local economic benefits become self-sustaining after a period of time. So you don't need as much corporate involvement over time. So you're talking about creating economic opportunity by shifting the balance of carbon from the air to the earth. It's actually very possible to have that be enough.
Right. Well, there are those who would disagree, and we'll have a chance to talk about that in a bit, but thank you for that. I want to make sure that people recognize there's not just forests and direct air capture involved. Farms and soils are an important part of the solution set too. And with that, I'm happy to pivot to Guy Hudson of Soil Company in Australia recently with a large announcement. Guy, please tell us a bit about what you do and where you're going.
Sure. Thank you, Julio. So Soil Carbon Co, we're working to realise the potential of what is one of the world's largest carbon sinks. As Julio mentioned, our soil. And this is something that we've known for a long time, and from a farmer's perspective, we've been very good at building soil carbon through regenerative practices and through management of that land and reaping the agronomic benefits of doing so. But over the last 40, 50 years or so, we've degraded a lot of the carbon in our soils, and we've degraded a lot of the productivity and health in that soil through some agricultural practices. So what we're doing is we're working towards putting that health back into the soil by overcoming 3 specific challenges when it comes to realizing the potential of our soils as a carbon sink. The first one is around adaptability, ensuring that it isn't just small groups of specific farming systems that are able to build soil carbon, but actually engaging all of agriculture, including conventional farming systems, as we move forward. The second piece is around predictability of outcomes. So while we're very, very good at building soil carbon in terms of through some regenerative practices, the outcomes tend to be very variable. And what we need is really predictable outcomes, both for those growers on an agronomic basis, but then also for the environment from a climate and carbon perspective. And the final piece is around persistence. So we work very hard to deliver technologies that create long-term stable carbon in our soil. So when you think about agriculture and carbon, actually the pictures of the fans behind Laurie are quite good representations of this in a funny way. So we plant about 1 million wheat plants, say, per hectare on average. If you just think about those wheat plants as a fan on its end, effectively what you've got is an infrastructure that covers 1.8 billion hectares around the world, constantly sucking in CO2, converting it to sugars, exuding those sugars into the soil, and then it's being broken back down. So we've got all these fans already in situ. We've got our infrastructure. We've also got a workforce. We've got 1 billion people working in agriculture around the world who spend every day working at that intersection of atmosphere and soil. But what we need to do now is work out, in the same way as Laurie will be scrubbing CO2 from the atmosphere using her processes, we need to work out how we can scrub a little bit of that CO2 from that process and put it into a really stable form, which will stay there for the long term. So we do that through applying specific communities of microbes to our agricultural crops. They grow with the crop in a mutually beneficial relationship. So they provide benefit to that plant in the season of application, but they also create very stable compounds in the soil. So things like melanin, the compound that's in your skin, that the communities that we apply are also very good at increasing the structure in that soil. So it's not just the compounds that they create, but it's also where they put it. So they help to build up aggregation and something called soil microaggregate, basically tiny compressed balls of soil. And that's a really safe place to store carbon for the long term. We've dated carbon in soil microaggregate back hundreds of years. This is somewhere that we can keep it there for the long term. But it's really not just about that long-term element. It's about the potential to be able to improve the productivity and the resilience of our soils today as well.
I hope to come back to questions of ancillary benefits in a little bit. In the interest of time, I want to make sure that we give Lucas an opportunity to make a quick comment here. Guy, I'll come back to a question for you in a moment. But first, the panel that's here represents a broad set of approaches, and all of these approaches are approaches that Microsoft has considered in their own planning, both for CO2 reduction and for CO2 removal as an enterprise. And so I'd like to turn it over to Lucas in terms of how he thinks about the scale of the problem and how a company like Microsoft can contribute to the solution set.
Yeah, well, thanks for putting this panel together. I've been learning a lot. I think it's been fascinating. You're right. It really spans, from the far right of nature-based solutions to the far left of technology-based and direct air capture. And I would just say to all the panelists, I've been following all of your work over the past years, and I'm super inspired and motivated by what you do. I'm just I'm just very lucky to be able to play a role in helping to try to accelerate some of this, of these efforts. And look, I think that, you know, Julio, you mentioned it at the top, the reports that are coming out, like it or not, say that this is, and Jules, you mentioned this as well. I liked your comment, you know, this isn't a silver bullet, this is silver buckshot. I think it literally is every approach that we have available to us needs to be put into play. I'm extremely motivated by the scale that soil carbon sequestration offers, and the market and the workforce, and taking all of that and putting it to work. You know, the voluntary markets that corporations you know, play in today. I was fascinated by kind of, Julio, you and Bill's conversation on that, about how voluntary markets might need to shift. My personal take on it is, I think they will shift, whether it's because they're increasingly regulated by governments or not. Julio, you and I were mentioning this in our last conversation. I think that every company that is setting voluntary commitments in 2020 will find by 2030 that achieving those commitments is not voluntary, right? I think that there is, you know, you will pay the price for not achieving those, and you're going to have to achieve them at a price point that makes sense for the organization that you work for. I'm privileged to be at Microsoft. We're a little bit more flexible in our price point, which means that we can be a little bit earlier in the market in procuring carbon removal, and that's why, you know, we put out this million metric ton carbon removal RFP recently. And what was so interesting was to see the responses to that RFP really did cover the full spectrum of negative emissions technologies, negative emissions approaches. So I just think, you know, we spent 20 years arguing about what the right solution was, right? And it didn't get us very far. It got us to where we are today, which is every solution is the right solution. And so, you know, I was never that enthusiastic about those conversations previously. I'm still not enthusiastic about them now. What I am enthusiastic about are conversations about what the price needs to be and what the scale potential of each of the components of the removal portfolio actually is, so that we can understand. I think we still have a lot of work to do, and I'm actually bullish, not bearish on this. We still have a lot of work to do in fully understanding the potential removal of the full portfolio. I think, Laura, you mentioned something, you know, Goldman talking about almost the infinite elasticity of the DAC market. And in some, you know, and so that if you look at it in that respect, well, you know, renewables are infinite. Carbon is basically infinite at the limit to how much we've put in the atmosphere. So we can just keep going. But there are some realistic market-based constraints to the infinite elasticity. And so that's where I think the next, you know, year and a half are going to be hugely informative for the market. And then, Julio, I just wanted to follow up. You used a Mark Twain quote. And Mark Twain, you know, whether or not he said any of this stuff, I don't know, but, you know, he's always somebody that you can go to find some great quotes. And my favorite is, you know, climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. And which ultimately didn't come from him either. It came from a schoolboy as writing essays when he spent a year teaching. But what's so interesting about that quote is the fact that that is no longer true. That quote explains human progress. The stability of our predictions has allowed us to build physical infrastructure that has allowed our society to grow and prosper. That simple prediction is breaking down explains the global panic. It's not so much, in my mind, that, you know, the economic and environmental devastation that will come down upon us. It's the complete and utter lack of predictability that has built our entire society. And as a business, in our last conversation earlier, we talked about, for Microsoft to do well, we need the world to do well. We don't just need the world to do well, we need to understand and be able to predict the path that the world is on. And for those of you who have seen the climate spirals, the destabilization kind of visualization that came out of academic lab in the UK, that really explains that destabilization, that lack of predictability. That's the terrifying part. And
yeah, the widening gyre.
Yeah, and I would just bring, if I can bring that back, the predictability then that we need is not just about the climate. We need better predictability about where the carbon removal markets are going. And for me, that's the defining need over the next year to year and a half in this conversation.
Right, and it starts with where we started with before the happy talk is over. Like, we got to be clear-eyed about how much work there is to do. I am no longer interested in people saying, well, I just like one thing. I don't care if you like one thing, we need all things, and that's the arithmetic. And in that context, we have to be really clear-eyed about carbon as a thing. I wake up every morning thinking about tons in the atmosphere. And in that context, I want to sort of go back to a point that Guy sort of brought up and that Bill alluded to. Often these discussions are couched in terms of ancillary benefits. They're couched in terms of wealth to developing nations, or improved soil health, or jobs and so forth. We can actually deliver all those things and not deliver tons. The problem is actually that tons is hard, and getting the tons is not the same thing as getting the ancillary benefits. I understand that they're sweeteners, but really focusing on the abatement is hard. How do you guys think about that in your own enterprises? How do you make sure that we're actually getting the tons as a matter of serving your customers and as a matter of governance? Guy, if you don't object, since I cut you off short earlier, I'll let you have the first run.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're in quite an interesting position with soil carbon. So we're building a product that is useful, irrelevant of the kind of the carbon benefit. The agronomic benefits are such that this technology will help us to produce more food, more nutritious food and for a longer time. And so that for us is really the most important thing. We want to build a brilliant product that works really effectively as a tool for our farmers. But in addition to that, we then have the potential to be able to almost have carbon removal as an ancillary benefit. So kind of spinning it slightly on its head. What we're actually doing is, the key for me is always about aligning the economic incentive with the environmental imperative. In the case of agricultural businesses, what we need to do is to provide a tool which works really effective in terms of that farming business, But then if we do that, then having the environmental imperative alongside that allows us to realize the potential of one of the world's largest carbon sinks. So for me, the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. We really can focus on just creating quality products, and as part of that, be able to provide a really important environmental service.
Sure. Bill, Jules, do you want to comment on that as well?
I'm happy to start. From my perspective, there are two important things to bear in mind. The first one is that we need to get all of these technologies and methodologies to scale very, very fast. But in many instances, there is a significant investment that needs to happen now, and then the benefits come later. It's the essence of a tree, right? Best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. Next best time is today. It's going to take a little while before that tree absorbs a lot of CO2. And the same will hold true in some forms for carbon sequestration in soils. And the same holds true is Lori needs to build these plants and get them down the cost curve and make them more cost effective. So how do we mobilize the capital at scale right now so that over time we start sequestering? But that then immediately also brings up a second point. If the carbon benefit comes over time, how do we know for sure we're going to deliver on that promise? How do we measure? How do we certify? How do we assure durability of that carbon benefit? And I think if the time is now and we need to get things done, and we need to march all of these technologies down the cost curve so that they become more cost effective. The other thing we need to do right now is to put in place the mechanisms for measurement, for certification, for assurance of durability, so that all the big investments we're going to be making over the next couple of years, we can actually track and monitor and see that they deliver the impacts on carbon that we're seeking over the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, that kind of like structural, that kind of like knowledge infrastructure, data aggregation function is often sort of swept under the rug or not really acknowledged. We need knowledge infrastructure. We also need physical infrastructure, stuff like CO2 pipelines, stuff like satellite networks. We need actually things to be deployed in order for all this stuff to work. I do want to give you a quick chance to comment, Bill, and then I want to pivot to a different topic.
Sure. One of the things that you mentioned, that was mentioned, is the chaos, the unpredictability, and there is just on the measurement side of things, psychopathy tends to acknowledge chaos as opportunity, and that's where you get a lot of bad actors seeing the chaos as an opportunity to do stuff. And measurement and high quality tools is the only way to really counteract that. We've seen so many times small tree planting organizations selling the same tree over and over and over to different people. Then we've also seen communities band together, plant trees. As soon as the funding runs out, they cut the trees down, turn them into charcoal, and get another hit of cash. The question of the ancillary benefits, I have to side on carbon is the ancillary benefit. You've got to construct what you're doing in such a way that it's beneficial anyway, and that the carbon sequestration is a natural component of that. Yes, well, it would be nice to have a stable carbon price. Yes, it would be nice to have regulation, all those things. What we've built at WeForest works anyway. Because we empower village women, the village head woman is going to cut the nuts off the village headman before he cuts her nut tree down, right? There are huge incentives baked into the way we train and the way we encourage that makes keeping the forest in place and planting more trees just a kind of duh moment. Whereas,
yeah, but don't we also need speed? Don't we need validity and verification? Don't we need consequences for the kind of actions you've discussed? These are all fundamentally questions of governance. I'll let you take the first bite at this apple, but then sort of move to Lucas after this, and Lori and Jules. We don't have any, I mentioned this in my last conversation with Lucas, we don't have anything like the Securities and Exchange Commission doing this. We don't have penalties for fraud. We don't have retribution and fines and damages for people who are bad actors. And we don't have, a mature certification process. So I'm not doubting anything you're saying, Bill. I completely am prepared to accept everything that you said is true. But if we need to get to 5 gigatons by the end of this decade and 10 gigatons by the end of the next, then we're just going to need to go faster and bigger and broader. And I want to open up this question of sort of governance and tracking and process.
Okay, so there are 4 different things that you've baked into the one question, right? So,
and we've only got a minute to go, and Lucas will be joining off soon. So everybody, quickly,
we need more
please.
Speed? Yes, we need more speed. WeForest is at the forefront of the measurement, certification, auditing, satellite tracking. We're involved in all that because we've been at it for a very long time. So I agree with all of those things, but that doesn't mean that the carbon needs to be the core focus. It's actually often better that the carbon is the ancillary benefit, even though you have to measure it, because it's the other services that are the things that are going to drive people, the right incentive for the time. And a big part of the right incentive for us is simply the amazing branding of trees. And that's often discounted, but that's actually a technologically sophisticated thing. So yeah, we need more speed. Yes, it's great when we have rule of law, and I'm supportive of that. And yes, we need more scale. But it is a mistake in my view just to focus on the carbon, that's all.
Right. Well, the converse of that is that we can hit all 17 other sustainability goals and not hit carbon. And that's the track we're on now and the track we've been on. So we actually do need that. We actually do need to focus on the tons because we have continued to fail. So in that context, I want to ask Lucas, sorry, I want to ask, pardon me. I'd like to give Lucas the final word before he leaves. He's got to leave in just a moment and then open back up to the panel. Lucas?
Yeah, so I would just say quickly, I mean, I think that ancillary benefit, or what's the ancillary benefit, is a little bit of semantics in the sense of where the incentivization is coming. In the absence of regulatory reform, I believe that some of the more sustainable options are to look at carbon as the ancillary benefit, because that's the sustainable option to ensure that removal remains. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be the only incentivization moving forward, and so I think that conversation will shift. I would just say, and I'll leave it here. I think we talk a lot about the information age that we live in today. This wild digital information age, and it's got to be the most narcissistic term that humanity's ever come up with, right? Because that information is about us, right? We still know precious little about the natural world. And I think that, there are some things that we know. We know the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's great, at least at a few, particular points. What we don't really know, we've got pie charts and wedges and this and that, is where all of those emissions are coming from and when. We're getting a little bit better, but we're still working. This conversation is the next step, which is equally important. We need to know where emissions are coming from, and then we need to know where they're going, i.e. when they're getting pulled out. I think, that one of the reasons DAC and direct air capture and the sorts of technologies Lori's working on are so, appealing is because you don't have to put up a satellite system to figure out, where all this is going. You don't have to deploy an army of sensors in agricultural fields to know, that the carbon is being sequestered. But against all of these solutions, I would simply say that monitoring and verification is the single building block that needs to be put in place to unleash the market potential that companies like Microsoft not just see, but so desperately desire. And so that's what I'm focusing on over the next couple of years.
Well, excellent, and thank you for that. Again, I know you have to go. I would vouchsafe that the age of reason is equally narcissistic, but in that context, certainly we have a contender here. Jules, very briefly, and then I want to get one last topic in.
Yeah, I want to build on what Lucas just said, which is this importance of having the data, and draw your attention to a recent announcement that we made as an organization together with What Time, a sister organization of Rocky Mountain Institute, Vice President Gore, a number of other organizations, an open source global information system that allows us to know at any moment in time where emissions are going up in the atmosphere of all greenhouse gases, so that we are no longer dependent on the slow-moving, retroactive, nationally driven MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, that currently drives all the climate discussions, but that we have at our fingertips an understanding of where greenhouse gas emissions are happening and where we're sequestering carbon in real time, globally, and in a trusted way wherever it's here. That's the right data. That, to our mind, is really crucial, and have a look at Climate Trace as a step in that direction.
Excellent. I want to pivot to the topic of innovation. All of you have talked about the importance of technology and the value that it can provide. Recently, the Energy Futures Initiative, led by Secretary Ernie Moniz, did a report that said in the US alone, we need $1 billion a year of investment in RD&D, probably closer to basically $10 billion over 10 years. We're starting to see the EU create funds on this, the United Kingdom to create funds on this. Because it's so important in terms of the work of your companies, as well as the scale up of these enterprises, I was hoping that you would each talk just a little bit about where you think we should focus our time on innovation, what the value is that it would provide. I'm going to start with Lori because it's sort of closest to her company, but I know that you all have thoughts on this. Lori?
Sure, thanks, Julio. Innovation is incredibly important, and I guess it comes from you know, all of this really great discussion about, you know, how do we solve climate change? We need a number of things. We need to raise awareness about the problem. I think a lot has happened, and even in the last few years, about the world understanding better how many CO2 molecules we have up and how many tons we need to take out. We also need to be able to see clearly, and that's where Microsoft's actually doing some great groundbreaking work, what's possible, what kind of carbon dioxide removal is possible, if we invest here, here, and here, how many tons do we remove, and also what are the co-benefits. But we also need to have the world understand how much each of those solutions cost, and then figure out, really with scarce dollars to solve climate change, how do we invest in the best way to get the biggest bang for our buck. And so on that front, you know, our focus is really direct air capture and carbon removal through sequestration is already a lot less expensive than many of the solutions that the world is working on. So we're really excited about the potential to at least start to have a meaningful role, but also innovation is what drives our costs down. And so we work really hard on how do we make our processes more efficient, and also how do we work with our supply chain suppliers so that those off-the-shelf pieces of equipment also come down in price, and then how are we going to come down in price through learnings. And so the growing research and development budgets to help do innovations at all parts of our supply chain and on our overall process are incredibly important. They will help us to get those costs down and get more broadly deployed so that it's even more affordable to do this at scale.
Indeed, and we're starting to see laws and bills coming together to support demonstrations as well as the R&D in order to do that learning by doing. And that can apply to, again, all of the different groups we're talking about here. Because we're short on time, I'm going to pivot to Guy, and then Bill, and then Jules for the last word on this. Guy, how do you guys think about innovation? How would it help your enterprise?
I mean, so we're our business is working in microbial technology. Microbes are a really just incredibly complex area of research and science, and it's one that we deeply don't understand yet. And for me, there is an enormous amount of work to be done in terms of understanding clearly the interactions that are taking place, particularly in our soils, and understanding therefore the longevity and potential of us to be able to store atmospheric CO2 for the long term in our soils as soil carbon. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that research space, and there's a lot of work that we're doing with academic partners across the US and Australia in supporting that. But actually, ultimately, it does come back down to that measurement verification and that level of predictability. For us to be able to realize this potential, really what we need is the technologies to measure soil carbon sequestration at a very low cost. So some of the great work that Laurie's doing, it's a relatively confined system. You have the potential to be able to measure these things. The system that we're talking about, as I mentioned earlier, is 1.8 billion hectares of cropping land around the world. Like, this is not an easy thing to measure. And so really for us, that technology is incredibly powerful as a facilitator.
Right. And of course, there's things to be done as well, including manipulation of microbial consortia, including genetic modification of these things. There's an awful lot of range space here, plus innovation in business practice. Bill, you have seen a lot of innovation over your past 12, even 15 years. What do you think is sort of most essential and would help you scale most quickly?
So what helps us scale quickly isn't really where I think innovation needs to play more. In terms of, I'm a biotech investor. I'm a strong believer in biotech solutions. As Guy very rightly said, it's a complicated area. It's going to take time. I've seen things around limestone chemistry using biotechnology that are going to be revolutionary, but it's going to take more time. I think the key innovation that we need to see is a shift in consciousness. And, that's the thing that allows us to scale. Right now, there's still too much gainsaying of, simple technical solutions. And when we do a permaculture food forest, that is a technical solution, and it's a complex and innovative one. And yet we're kind of looked like we're tree hugging hippies from the 60s and not really scientific. There needs to be a shift in consciousness that nature-based solutions involve nature. And you need to get into that intersection of where humans can thrive alongside nature and within nature. And in fact, get rid of that fundamental arrogance that somehow we're not natural ourselves.
So you point to, among other things, just now in your comments to the need for sustained support, which delivers the innovations over time, as well as, again, the shift in consciousness. Some of that's being driven by youth movement today. Some of that's being driven by shareholder votes. Some of that's being driven by policy changes, and ultimately this will be a policy world. Jules, I'm going to leave you with the final words on this, thinking about a combination of innovation, not just in terms of technical or practical context, but also in terms of policy and markets.
Yeah, and Julio, you probably actually know more about this from your time at DOE, but the fragmentation with which we are driving innovation around the issue of climate change and energy around the world is really frustrating. And when we created Mission Innovation in the run-up to Paris about 5 years ago, there was some inkling that maybe better collaboration between governments and the private sector would drive big impact. And we've made some progress. More capital is being deployed. But I still don't see in the area of climate change and nature-based solutions and carbon sequestration the sort of tremendous sense of urgency to find a solution by really passionately driven global programs that we've seen over the last 3-4 months in the issue of a vaccine for the global pandemic. What does it take for us to step over the ideological mindset that governments don't pick winners and that this is an issue of national competitiveness, and say, no, this is a matter of survival of humanity on this planet? We have inordinate amounts of talent and significant amount of money being deployed. How do we coordinate, align, drive there where the biggest impact can be, really push for the big victories in certain areas that are necessary to get us down to a 1.5-degree world. So a different mandate for policymakers to coordinate and pick winners and drive the technology solutions we need. That's my plea.
Yes, this comes back to something that Lucas said. We shouldn't think about what we should do. We should think about what we can do. That's a useful way to sort of get into this bin. And fundamentally, this is the kind of work which, again, we're just going to need all hands on deck. In addition to the groups of people who are represented here, we're going to need social scientists, we're going to need lawyers, we're going to need investors, we're going to need civic leaders, we're going to need artists, we're going to need an enormous community of people to sort of bring this about. We really don't have time, as is witnessed by everything from the Australian brush fires of last year, which seem 100 years ago, to the California fires that are happening today, to the enormous floods in Bangladesh from a couple of months ago, to the present floods of the Louisiana Gulf Coast. We are simply out of time. Unfortunately, we are out of time today as well for this discussion. And in that context, I want to thank all of you. And again, thank the Founders Forum. I hope that you will take the opportunity to look all of these speakers up, including Lucas Joppa at Microsoft, who had to leave early, and myself at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Thank you all again.
Great, thank you all for tuning in. That's all for now, this first Climate Tech Summit, and we look forward to you joining more with us. Thank you.